So good morning, my name is Carlos Peña. I am the director for the Office of Neurological and Physical Medicine Devices at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health at the FDA. And the purpose of my presentation today is threefold. One is to introduce folks to the world of medical device regulation with a focus on medical devices targeting pain. Two, to share with you a few points to consider in device development, including factors relevant to pain studies. And three, share with you best ways to engage FDA. Next slide. At the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, our vision is the following. Patients in the US have access to high quality, safe, and effective medical devices of public health importance first in the world. And we take this vision seriously. And at the end of the day, our goal is the same as many of those in the research field for companies, for patients, in that we would like to see more treatment options for patients with pain. Next slide. Medical devices are classified into class 1, 2, and 3, with regulatory control increasing from class 1 to class 3. The device classification regulation defines the regulatory requirements for a general device type, and most pain devices are right where that smiley face is, between class 2 and class 3 classifications. For example, most class 1 devices are exempt from submitting an application to FDA. Most class 2 devices require what's called pre-market notification, or they're known as a 510K. And most class 3 devices require what's known as pre-market approval. And we provide oversight across 3 classes using tools known as general and special controls, for which we help to communicate to sponsors what they need to do to provide and meet their regulatory obligations. Next slide. We have been engaged in this technology sector for some time, and this is a favorite slide of mine. Here I show you an array of products with neurological indications, beginning with neurothrombectomy devices, to epilepsy, deep brain stimulation, neurodiagnostics, to prosthetics, to therapeutic devices for migraine, pain, and microcatheters for the neurovasculature during neurosurgery. Goal is not to discuss individual data in support of each device, but share with you that each device went through a regulatory path that was in part tailored to the individual risk and benefit profile of the device. And I'm going to come back to this later in the presentation. We take this approach of tailoring our reviews for pain devices, and I'll come back to that as well. Next slide. Here is a list of a few examples of medical devices with indications for pain relief. And each of these examples, submissions are sent to FDA, for which we tailor our reviews to the safety and effectiveness of that particular product. And they include spinal cord stimulators, transcutaneous nerve stimulation, peripheral nerve stimulation, ultrasound, and muscle stimulation, to name a few. Next slide. And here I share with you some of the challenges that are associated with pain devices studies, including the following: the difficulty to blind if paresthesia is required for pain relief, the potential for a large placebo response due to the subjective nature of the primary outcome measure, and the difficulty to account for concomitant therapies during the course of study. The best way to reconcile these challenges is engaging with FDA early. And one of the best ways to do this is via the pre-submission process. And I'll return to this process later in the slide presentation. Next slide. And so one question that you may have is, when is a clinical study warranted? And typically clinical studies may be warranted if, for example, there are measurable differences in the range of stimulation parameters to marketed devices that I just mentioned in the previous slide, or if the use of the technology or output parameters differs than currently marketed products or is novel as a new product, and especially if the device does not provide a sensation, the paresthesia, when using the device. So it provides a different way to treat patients. Again, the best way to talk about requirements is via the pre-submission process, again, to discuss in just a few slides. Next slide. And additional points to consider include with medical devices targeting pain indications is identifying the specific etiology of pain that may be targeted in a medical device study. Is this a vulnerable patient population that is targeted in a particular study? Is the type of pain different from the pain targeted in prior marketed devices? Or is a new patient population of interest, such as a more refractory patient population than the one currently approved for currently marketed devices or for the new devices? Next slide. What is important to understand in that in almost every instance the submission comes in, we assess a number of issues for any given application, including the risk classification, the valid scientific evidence supporting the safety and effectiveness of the device, the benefits and risks of the device, the data of prior studies or prior use of the product, either US or overseas, the least burdensome approach to getting the product to the marketplace, and the indications for use are few of the factors that we look at during our review of any given particular submission. These concepts are regularly evaluated during the course of review, and we depend heavily on sponsors and developers and innovators and investigators to help us understand and address many of these concepts during the course of the review. There are other factors when we see a submission, when we take a look at a product, and the best way to make sure to address all the factors is through early engagement. And this is a recurring theme that you're hearing now about how to engage the FDA early. Next slide. One very important consideration is how we define valid scientific evidence that I mentioned in the previous slide, which can include well-controlled investigations all the way to reports of significant human experience. The take-home message here is that despite the variety and the multiple ways in which evidence may be submitted to the agency, we use a variety of data sets and a variety of other information to reach a conclusion about a device to help potentially bring promising medical product to patients in the US. Next slide. We also evaluate safety and work with sponsors to collect all the adverse events that have any possible relation to the device and those events that are collected from the time of consent. We also look in some cases to have independent adjudication of those events. And we like to make sure we understand the events that have been observed through a standardized nomenclature. Next slide. We also take very seriously a statistical analysis plan that clearly identifies how the data will be analyzed at the completion of the study. Again, an aspect of device development that should be discussed early in the process, preferably before the study is even conducted. Next slide. And so I would like to move to just a quick discussion about the FDA engagement. And one of the best ways to engage FDA is via the pre-submission process. Pre-submissions allow you to introduce medical devices to FDA, identify the critical non-clinical and clinical issues that may be needed in moving a product to the marketplace. And most important, the sponsors and developers of the pre-submissions, once they have that information from the agency, it can help to make business decisions, exact investments, and reach reasonable expectations about the regulatory landscape for a given product, which can again provide a very efficient way to identify what's needed to move that product to the marketplace. We also use pre-submissions to allow for potentially challenging issues to be identified early on before this study is conducted. And the pre-submission process is a free process, which I think also helps all the parties involved. So next slide. So a few closing remarks. One, find out more about FDA. I presented some information here, but the best way to engage is through the pre-submission process. Two, if you think it's too early to contact us, that's exactly the time to contact us, especially for medical devices of pain, which have an important public health area of interest and importance here in the US. And three, the more communication we have, the better off you are in moving products to patients and caregivers, and the American consumer. Thank you.